While the old powers of the world were busy, their eyes glued to conflicts of their own making, a quiet ceremony in West Africa just sent shockwaves across the globe. On June 26, 2025, inside the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, a young captain, with revolution in his voice and the weight of a nation on his shoulders, stood to receive the credentials of 8 new ambassadors. Now, this wasn't just some diplomatic formality. It wasn't just a few handshakes and a photo op for the evening news. No, this was something else entirely. This was a declaration. In the very halls where the ghosts of colonial masters once roamed, a new map of the world was being drawn. A map where the lines of power no longer flow from Paris or Washington, but radiate outwards from the capitals of a rising global south. The 8 nations that stood there to honor Captain Ibrahim Traoré, India, Turkey, Cuba, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, Sierra Leone, Luxembourg, and Bangladesh, weren't chosen by accident. Each one was a deliberate move, a chess piece placed with strategic precision. So how did this seemingly routine diplomatic event become a move that has the world on high alert? To understand the earthquake, you have to understand the pressure that's been building underground for decades. This is the story of how a single ceremony became the symbol of a continent's defiant awakening. To really get why that day in June mattered so much, you have to go back. You have to look at the system designed to keep Africa on its knees. For over a century, the story of French-speaking Africa was a story written in Paris. They called it France Afrique, a shadowy web of political favors, economic dependency, and military muscle that made sure French interests always came first, usually at the expense of African sovereignty. At the heart of this neo-colonial machine was the CFA franc, the currency used by 14 African nations, including Burkina Faso. For decades, these nations were forced to deposit 50% of their foreign currency reserves into the French treasury. Just think about that. A system where half of your country's wealth, earned from your land and your people, was held in the vaults of your former colonizer. Proponents claimed it guaranteed stability, but leaders across Africa saw it for what it was: a golden leash. A way to control their economies, kill industrial growth, and make sure true financial freedom was never more than a dream. It was stability, sure, but it was the stability of a well-run plantation. But the control wasn't just financial, it was physical. For years, the Sahel was dotted with French military bases. Operations like Barkhane were launched under the banner of fighting terrorism. French soldiers, we were told, were there to protect the fragile states of the region. And for a while, people wanted to believe it. But as the years dragged on, the security situation didn't get better. It got worse. Violence spread, instability grew, and a suspicion began to creep into the minds of the people in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Was this military presence a solution, or was it part of the problem? Was it really about terror, or was it about protecting French interests in uranium, gold, and a strategic military foothold? The anger was real. You could feel it on the streets of Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou. A new generation was rising up, and they saw the contradiction plain as day. A land with some of the richest gold deposits in the world, yet its people were trapped in poverty. A land with foreign troops on its soil, yet its own soldiers were under-equipped and its people lived in fear. This growing anger was fertile ground for the memory of a man whose ghost has haunted West Africa for decades: Captain Thomas Sankara. Back in the 1980s, Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader, dared to dream of something different. He changed the country's name from the colonial Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, land of the upright people. He vaccinated millions, championed women's rights, and planted 10 million trees to fight back the desert. And most dangerously of all, he talked about self-sufficiency. He rejected foreign aid, calling it a tool of control. Sankara's famous words echoed through the years: "He who feeds you, controls you." His defiance was electric, but it was cut short. In 1987, he was assassinated in a coup that many believe had the fingerprints of foreign intelligence all over it. His death was a warning to any other African leader who dared to step out of line. The message was clear: your sovereignty has limits, and we define them. For 30 years, that warning seemed to work. But the ideas of Sankara, dignity, sovereignty, Pan-African pride, they never really died. They just went dormant, waiting for someone brave enough to water them again. History isn't always made by the loudest person in the room. Sometimes, it's moved by the quiet resolve of someone who has simply seen enough. Captain Ibrahim Traoré wasn't a politician groomed for power. He was a soldier, born in 1988. He grew up in the shadow of Sankara's murdered dream. At 37, he's one of the world's youngest leaders, a man who rose not from a political office, but from the front lines of a failing war. As a captain in an anti-terrorism unit, Traoré saw the hypocrisy up close. He saw Burkinabe soldiers fighting and dying with poor equipment, while elites in the capital got rich and the foreign partners who promised security couldn't or wouldn't stop the bleeding. This wasn't just a strategic failure, it was a national humiliation. And he wasn't the only one who felt that way. It was a feeling shared by his fellow officers and by millions of his people. His rise to power in late September 2022 wasn't just another military coup. It was the explosion of years of pent-up frustration. The government he overthrew was itself a military junta that had promised to fix the security mess, but was seen as just another puppet of France. Traoré's move was seen by many not as a power grab, but as a restoration of national honor. From his very first speech, you knew this was different. He spoke a language that hadn't been heard from the presidential palace in over 30 years. He talked about sovereignty, about Pan-Africanism. He said the fight wasn't just against terrorists, but against the neo-colonial system that created them. He was directly echoing Thomas Sankara, promising win-win partnerships, and that Burkina Faso would now look at other horizons. And he backed it up with action. In early 2023, his government did the unthinkable. It ordered all 400 French Special Forces troops to leave the country. Then the French ambassador was told to pack his bags. He was systematically cutting the strings that had controlled his nation for decades. Of course, the reaction from the West was immediate and predictable. He was branded a junta leader, an autocrat, a guy who was isolating his country. They warned that by pushing France away, Burkina Faso was opening the door to Russia. But what they didn't seem to get, or refuse to admit, was that for the Burkinabe people, the old system had already failed. The stability they were being offered had only brought poverty and fear. For them, Traoré's actions weren't a gamble. They were a long overdue act of survival. He met their narrative head-on. In his public speeches, often in his simple army fatigues, he framed this as a second war of liberation. He wasn't isolating his country. He was freeing it to choose its own friends. This quiet captain was now fighting a new kind of war on the world stage, a war of narratives. And the ceremony, on June 26, would be his biggest move yet. The scene at the Kuluba Palace, on June 26, was that of a nation remaking its own destiny. This wasn't the nervous energy of a new regime looking for approval. This was the calm, deliberate act of a state asserting its power. The red carpet, the full military honors, every detail sent one message. Burkina Faso is not a client state. It is a sovereign power. As the 8 ambassadors prepared to present their credentials, the world was watching the public unveiling of Ibrahim Traoré's new foreign policy. It was a masterclass in diplomacy, and each country there represented a pillar in the new world he was trying to build. First up, India. And that's no accident. India, a giant of the global south, represents the ultimate alternative to the old power games. This isn't about aid with strings attached. It's about cooperation between nations that have fought the same battles. For years, India has been a quiet partner in Burkina Faso. helping with solar power, farming, and tech. By putting India front and center, Traoré was signaling a pivot to a partner that offers collaboration without the colonial baggage. Next, Turkey. This is a fascinating move. Turkey, a NATO member, has carved out its own fiercely independent foreign policy. For Burkina Faso, Turkey is a game-changer for security. Turkish-made drones are a potent, affordable alternative to Western military hardware. Plus, Turkish companies are building major infrastructure all over Africa without the political lectures. This partnership is a direct challenge to France's old role as the region's security provider. The arrival of the Cuban ambassador was pure, revolutionary symbolism. The bond between Cuba and Africa was forged in the fire of anti-imperialist struggle. Thomas Sankara himself was close with Fidel Castro. By reigniting this bond, Traoré is getting more than just access to Cuba's famous healthcare system. He's making a powerful ideological statement, placing his government in a global tradition of resistance. Gabon and Equatorial Guinea. Seeing ambassadors from two Central African nations shows another key part of Traoré's vision. African solutions for African problems. For too long, African nations were told to look to Europe for help. This is a deliberate turn inward. Both Gabon and Equatorial Guinea are oil-rich, offering potential energy partnerships. But more than that, their presence is about strengthening African unity and trade. Sierra Leone. The handshake with the ambassador from Sierra Leone was a handshake between two nations that know what it means to survive. Both countries have lived through civil war and the long struggle of rebuilding. This isn't a donor-recipient relationship. It's a partnership of survivors, sharing lessons on how to build peace from the ground up, on their own terms. Bangladesh might seem like an odd choice, but its inclusion is a stroke of genius. Bangladesh offers Burkina Faso a blueprint. Once one of the world's poorest nations, it engineered an economic miracle based on its own homegrown ideas. By building a bridge to Dhaka, Burkina Faso is bypassing the Western gatekeepers of development and learning from a nation that has already walked the path. Luxembourg. And then there was Luxembourg. At first glance, that might seem like the odd one out, right? A small, wealthy EU nation. But this is where Traoré's strategy gets really smart. Luxembourg isn't a former colonial power. It's a global financial hub. Traoré isn't isolating his country. He's diversifying its portfolio. He's keeping a channel open to European investment, but on his own terms. He's saying Burkina Faso is open for business, but the price of admission is no longer its sovereignty. Each of those 8 handshakes was a chapter in a new story. A story of diversification, South-South solidarity, and Pan-African pride. On June 26, Ibrahim Traoré showed the world his cards. The fallout from June 26 landed hardest in the old centers of power. In Paris, Brussels, and Washington, the reaction was a mix of public denial and private panic. Officially, they were monitoring the situation and had concerns. They framed it as Ouagadougou isolating itself from its natural partners. But behind closed doors, the mood was serious. This wasn't just one small country changing its mind. This was a domino. It started in Mali. Now Burkina Faso and Niger have joined forces in the Alliance of Sahel States, AES. This was a coordinated rebellion. The Western media, whether they knew it or not, became the first line of attack. The narrative was set almost immediately. Captain Traoré wasn't a liberator. He was a power-hungry dictator. His new alliances weren't with partners, they were with autocrats. This wasn't a pivot to sovereignty. It was a pivot to Russia and China, just swapping one master for another. They were trying to debunk the very idea of African agency, to paint it as a dangerous fantasy. But this media war is just air cover for the real fight, economic warfare. When their soldiers are asked to leave, they turn to the weapons of finance. Threats of sanctions, freezing assets, cutting off aid, and pressuring the IMF and World Bank. These are the modern tools of colonial discipline. The message is simple: step out of line, and we will make your economy scream until your people turn on you. And that is exactly why Traoré's domestic policies are so important. He knows political sovereignty means nothing without economic sovereignty. The real reason the world is shaking is his government's move to take back control of Burkina Faso's gold. The plan to demand a state stake in new mines, to build a national refinery to process the gold at home, and to review existing foreign-owned contracts is a direct assault on the whole system. For decades, foreign companies have pulled billions in gold out of Burkinabe soil, while the nation saw pennies on the dollar. Traoré is trying to turn off that tap. That is the existential threat he poses. The ceremony was the symbol, but the fight for the gold mines is the substance. The old powers aren't shaking because they care about democracy in Burkina Faso. They are shaking because their business model is being threatened. And that is a rebellion they can't afford to let succeed. What we saw on June 26 wasn't just a photo op. It was the moment Captain Ibrahim Traoré turned the ideals of sovereignty and Pan-Africanism into hard policy. The choice of those 8 ambassadors wasn't an act of isolation. It was the calculated move of a leader who gets that in the 21st century, real independence isn't about cutting yourself off from the world. It's about having the freedom to choose your own friends. This was the final rejection of a world where African nations were supposed to stay in their lane, their hands out for aid while their policies were written in foreign capitals. Traoré, walking in the footsteps of Thomas Sankara, has declared that the age of bowing down is over. The partnerships with India and Bangladesh show that development can come from the south. The alliances with Turkey and Cuba prove that security can be found outside the old power blocks. And the embrace of Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and Sierra Leone confirms the belief that Africa's greatest strength is its own unity. This movement is bigger than one man or one country. The alliance of Sahel states, the pact between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, is the core of this new resistance. They are showing the world it's possible to say no to the old masters and build a future on your own terms. What the world witnessed was a glimpse of a new, multipolar reality. It's a reality that is, without a doubt, threatening to those who have profited from the old system. But for millions across Africa and the global south, it is a source of deep inspiration. It's a sign that the long night of neo-colonialism might finally be ending, and that a new dawn of African self-determination is breaking. The roar of the African lion is getting louder. And it's a roar that demands not just to be heard, but to be respected. The world isn't just shaking, it's being reshaped. The story of Burkina Faso's rise is the story of Africa's awakening. The mainstream narrative will try to twist this, to frame it as a story of risk and instability. They don't want you to see it for what it is, a courageous fight for dignity and freedom. If you believe in the right of all nations to determine their own destiny, if you believe that Africa's future should be in the hands of Africans, then you are part of this awakening. Share this video. Spread this message far and wide. Let the world know the real story of what is happening in the heart of the Sahel.